Hi there, Social Studies 20. Here is your Chapter 8 vocabulary. There's just a few words that I wanted to say a few things about. War Measures Act, number one. When Canada interned both the Ukrainian Canadians and Japanese Canadians during World Wars I and II, they did it under what was called the War Measures Act. And what it does is allows the government to rule without consent of Parliament. So the War Measures Act is kind of like declaring martial law. The government does not need parliamentary consent before it takes action, passes laws, policies, budgets, and so on. And so the War Measures Act is what allowed the Canadian government to intern the Ukrainian Canadians and Japanese Canadians. Uh, Kristallnacht is a term that technically would go better with Chapter 9, but I figured I'd put it in here just because Chapter 9 was getting a little too long. I wanted to keep them to under 10 words. State Shinto, again, we learned about when we studied Japan as well in Chapter 9, but I thought it would fit well here. And as well, you should understand Bushido is the warrior code. Will help you understand ultranationalism a little better as well. Finally, internment, that is the lockup of part of your population. Internment does not necessarily mean that it's going to lead to death camps and things like that. It could. It didn't in Canada, but from the German viewpoint, internment would eventually lead to the Holocaust, but it doesn't always have to lead to an ethnic cleansing. So don't confuse internment with death camps. Internment would lead to a concentration camp, but that's not the same thing as a death camp. A concentration camp is just the confinement of a large group of people. You might put them to work, but it's not a death camp like we would have seen in the Holocaust. Okay, I hope those little tidbits help. I threw the Great Depression in there too, just because a lot of this happens in the 1930s, the stuff we've been studying. The 1930s was a decade, known as the Great Depression or the Dirty 30s. You learn more about it in Social 30-1 and -2, but basically the Great Depression involved the collapse of Western economies, and I guess you could say global economies too. It started in 1929 with the stock market crash and would eventually lead to the closure of thousands of banks. Unemployment rates hit a soaring 25%. The Great Depression was the crippling of Western economies. There was no work for years. People were destitute. It looked like there was no real hope or end in sight. And that climate economically created an economic crisis that allowed for governments like the Nazis to come to power. Um, at the very least, that climate of the Great Depression and things that were created from it um, might have made World War II a little more possible because people, I wouldn't say they had more important things to worry about, but countries had other things to worry about than German expansionism, than stopping Italian or Japanese expansionism during the Great Depression. It also meant there wasn't a lot of money to go about stopping these countries from their expansionist policies. Probably has a lot to do with why the League of Nations failed as badly as it did, in that it should have really have taken action to stop aggression in the 1930s, but there wasn't a lot of money for that. Economies were crippled. They were destitute. They didn't have money to give to that kind of a cause. Okay, I'll leave you alone now, and you can work on your Chapter 8 vocabulary.